The scream didn't come from a man, but it cut through the pines with the same cracked desperation, sharp and raw like something breaking. George Harper had heard screams before, the kind that twisted through jungle vines and came out red on the other side, but this one wasn't from Vietnam, and it wasn't decades old, it was here, now, bleeding into the frozen breath of early morning. He raised the barrel of his shotgun without thinking, not for hunting, not for defense, but like a reflex from a past he couldn't shake, and stepped off the porch in socks soaked through with frost. It wasn't the scream that stopped him cold near the tree line, it was the silence that followed, a silence so sudden and unnatural, it felt like the world had inhaled and forgotten how to breathe again. He found her there, tangled in rusted wire and snow-spattered pine needles, one paw crushed inside a spring-loaded steel trap, the kind that doesn't just catch, it maims. She didn't growl, didn't whimper, didn't look away, her eyes locked with his the way a dying man locks eyes with the one holding morphine, not begging, just waiting for judgment. Blood had soaked the snow under her like ink spilled from a broken promise, and though her body shook from pain, her stare never flinched, not even when George leveled the shotgun straight between her eyes. Something about that moment, maybe the absence of fear, maybe the way her ears were laid flat not from submission but from something older, something like defiance, reached into a place inside him that hadn't been touched in years. He lowered the shotgun. The steel jaws took effort to pry open, and when they snapped loose with a sound like bone breaking, she didn't move, just lay there breathing through clenched teeth, as if daring the earth to finish what it started. He carried her the way he once carried his son after the boy's first fight, limp, bloodied, eyes filled not with pain but the bitter taste of betrayal. She was too heavy, too warm, too alive for a dead thing. By the time they reached the cabin, his arms were trembling, his chest heaving, and the voice inside him, the one that sounded like his son's on the last night they spoke, whispered, "You never knew how to save anything, did you?" He cleaned the wound, wrapped it in strips of an old army shirt, poured bourbon over it like fire on old wounds, and when she flinched but didn't cry, he nodded once like some unspoken pact had just been sealed. She didn't eat that night, didn't move much, but didn't try to run either. Instead, she stared at the door. 4 hours. As if waiting for someone she knew might still come. He didn't sleep, not because of fear, but because of the silence that sat between them, thick and breathing, like something waiting to be named. The next morning, she was gone. No blood trail, no scratch marks, just the bandage, torn and left behind near the door, and pawprints leading into the snow-fogged woods. George followed them without thinking, shotgun slung over his back, whispering to no one in particular, "If you wanted to die, girl, you wouldn't have stared me down like that." The prince led past the old logging road, across the shallow creek that froze thin in the middle, and ended near the edge of a clearing where the snow was disturbed, not just by pawprints, but by something else, heavier. A second trail. Boot tracks. Fresh. He crouched, touched the snow, still soft, still warm from weight, and looked toward the woods just as a rifle shot cracked the morning apart and echoed down through the trees like the ghost of a memory that refused to die. He dropped to the ground. Waited. Another shot, farther off now. Then silence. He followed the sound, not because he was brave, but because he had already lived through the worst and come out the other side with nothing left to lose. He found blood again. But not hers. This time, the tracks ended at a tree with a smear of something red along the bark, and on the ground, a torn scrap of fabric, thick, dark green, military issue, something he hadn't seen in years. He picked it up slowly. There were letters stamped on it, half torn by a claw mark but still readable. Property of S. Harper. And just like that, every door he thought he'd closed slammed open again. The dog wasn't just some stray. She had found him. She had come for a reason. And if the man in the woods had that patch, then somebody knew his son didn't die the way they all said he did. He turned back toward the cabin, heart pounding like jungle drums, whispering to the wind like it might answer. "What the hell did you see, girl?" She saw the man that night, came the answer, not from a voice George recognized, but from the cracked radio in the corner, a voice that shouldn't have been speaking, not here, not now, not from that dead channel no one used since the sheriff's office burned down 8 winters ago. He turned to the sound, heart already hammering against his ribs like it wanted out, and reached the radio just in time to hear the last whisper die beneath a hiss of static and the long, hungry silence that followed. Outside, something moved against the trees, not the wind, not an animal, but the slow, heavy drag of boots across frozen earth, like someone too tired to run and too proud to fall. George stepped out into the night, shotgun lowered but ready, and saw her standing in the snow again, her side matted with fresh blood, not her own this time, thick and dark, coating her like war paint, the kind that wasn't meant for show but for remembrance. She looked at him, not with panic or pleading, but with the same question he'd asked the wind hours ago, "Do you believe me now?" Behind her, something else glinted in the moonlight, a collar, heavy-duty, black leather, but worn and frayed like it had been torn from some darker place. He knelt and took it gently, ignoring the blood on his fingers, reading the single word burned into the underside in uneven, almost human-looking script. Ranger. Not a name he'd ever heard in town, not one spoken in the firehouse or the diner or even the old veterans' hall where people still wore secrets like medals. But she flinched when he said it out loud. Not from fear, but from memory. That was the night she stayed. She didn't sleep, just lay there near the door, muscles tight, ears up, eyes fixed on something George couldn't see, like she was waiting for it to knock. And come morning, it did. 3 dead chickens at the edge of the property, necks snapped, bodies arranged in a perfect, orderly row, not torn, not dragged, just laid out like an offering or a warning, the kind that says, "I know where you live, and I remember what you did." George didn't speak to anyone in town that day, not out of fear, but out of something colder, certainty. This wasn't the work of coyotes or wolves. This was a message. And someone out there still remembered his son's name, even after the obituary, the silence, and the years of polite forgetting that followed. He buried the birds, burned the collars, and when he returned to the cabin, she was waiting by the fire, not warming herself, but guarding the room like she'd done it before. That night, she walked into his room for the first time, limping still, but proud, and curled beside the old chest at the foot of his bed, the one filled with things he hadn't opened in over a decade. And then came the second sound. Not from outside this time, but from beneath the floorboards, a scratching, slow and deliberate, like something living was underneath, or something dead was remembering how to move again. George sat upright, eyes burning, reaching for the flashlight with hands that felt too old and too ready for this kind of fear. But the scratching stopped. And in its place, came the smallest of sounds, the slide of an envelope being pushed under a door that no longer existed. He looked down and saw it, pale yellow, curled at the edges, no address, no stamp, just a single word in all capital letters, written in the same hand that had once taught his son to write. Stop. He opened it with trembling fingers, expecting nothing and everything all at once, but what was inside was worse than anything he imagined. A photograph. Blurry, taken at night, but clear enough to recognize her, Ranger, chained in a metal cage, blood on her muzzle, and standing behind her, a man in a coat too clean, too pressed, too familiar. George didn't want to believe it, but there was no mistake. The man holding the chain was Lester Malone. His old hunting buddy. The one who helped build the porch. The one who gave the eulogy at his son's funeral. The one who brought bourbon and jokes and called George brother every time they met. And in the corner of the photo, half-shadowed but visible, taped to the cage in faded marker. S. Harper. Property tag number 14. That was the night George knew. The dog didn't just survive. She escaped. And someone wanted her dead, not because of what she'd done, but because of what she knew. The question now wasn't why she came back. It was who else saw her, and what they were willing to do to keep her quiet. As the fire cracked and Ranger curled beside him again, licking the old scar on her leg like a woman mourning a lost limb, George whispered into the darkness, "How deep does this go?" She knew everything, said the voice on the phone, trembling but clear, as if dragged up from the throat of someone who'd been holding in the truth for too many years, and was now choking on the weight of finally letting it go. George sat in his truck, the engine off, hands clenching the wheel with a pressure that made the old leather creak like bones shifting beneath old wounds that never properly healed. He hadn't touched that phone in months, hadn't even remembered charging it, but this morning, just before dawn, it lit up with a number he hadn't seen since the week his son was buried. The voice belonged to Karen Whitmore, the former reporter who once loved Samuel like family, who cried at the funeral harder than George ever could, and then vanished without a word or a goodbye. "I found something, George," she continued, her breath catching like someone who knew they were saying something they could never take back, something they wanted burned, something that should have stayed gone. She didn't wait for him to ask. Instead, the sound of rustling paper came through the line, followed by a heavy pause, and then words that came so quietly George had to lean forward just to catch the weight of them. "Your son didn't kill himself." The silence after that wasn't empty, it was a vacuum, a collapsing star of memory and guilt that pulled every breath from his lungs and left him blinking into the windshield like a man waking up from a coma he didn't know he was in. "They silenced him," she said, voice cracking now, like it hurt her to speak but hurt more not to. "He tried to tell me, George, the last month before he died, he was sending me letters. And then," she added, with a tremor that felt like betrayal bleeding through the phone line, "they started disappearing before they reached me." George remembered those nights, the way Samuel would sit out by the fire pit alone, a shoebox beside him filled with pages he never let his father read, and a bottle of something stronger than truth clenched too tight in one hand. "I was afraid," Karen admitted, her voice growing hoarse, like truth had teeth and was finally biting back. "I was scared of what it would mean if I believed him, if I believed what he said about the man with the dogs." George didn't speak, couldn't, because deep down, some awful part of him had always known there was more to that suicide than a broken heart and a shattered home. "I have the last letter," Karen said at last, as if she'd carried it in her bones all this time. "I didn't open it until this week. I couldn't. I was too much of a coward." The truck felt smaller now, like the truth was growing larger than the space it could occupy. "He names them," she said. "Names the place. The judge. The handlers. And someone else, someone he said you'd never suspect." Then, her voice dropped so low it was almost a whisper, filled with something that sounded like shame and sorrow braided together. "He names Malone." George's breath left him in a slow, crumbling exhale, like air escaping from an old wound that had been stitched too tight for too long. "I'm bringing it to you," she said. "But I'm not doing it alone. The dog, your dog, she was there. She saw everything. She survived it. That's why she came back. That's why they're still watching." George felt it then, the way the past sometimes folds in on itself like bad weather, swallowing time and memory until all that remains is the echo of one unanswered question: what else did she see that night? As he stepped out of the truck, he noticed something new near the tree line, not a trap this time, not a warning, but a fresh mark carved into the bark of an old oak, deep and wide, the shape unmistakable. It was the symbol the handlers used on the cages back in the underground ring Samuel once told him about, the kind where men with soft hands paid to watch stronger things tear each other apart for sport. And just beneath it, nailed carefully into the trunk, was a photograph, a new one, printed clean, with a date stamp from 2 nights ago, showing George asleep in his chair, the dog curled beside him. No windows had been broken. No locks had been picked. Someone had been inside. Suddenly, every creak in the floorboards, every flicker of the porch light, every time Ranger stared at the woods without blinking, it all came rushing back like floodwater. Someone was circling. Someone was waiting for George to step too far into the truth. But they hadn't counted on the dog coming back. They hadn't counted on the man waking up. He turned toward the cabin, toward Ranger, toward the fire still burning low, and muttered to the silence between them. "If they took his voice, then we'll use yours." "She doesn't need words," Karen said, her voice trembling as she stepped over the broken threshold of George's cabin, holding the unopened letter like a piece of living history, because the way she moves tells you exactly what they did to her. Ranger stood perfectly still by the cold hearth, her body tense, her ears forward, her eyes locked on the dark window behind Karen, where just moments earlier a shadow had passed that did not belong to the trees or the wind. They all heard it, the soft scrape of a boot on gravel, the kind of misstep made not by accident but by overconfidence, the kind that told you whoever was out there didn't fear being hurt anymore. George reached for the shotgun, not because he needed it to act, but because it reminded his shaking hands how to be steady when the past came home wearing boots soaked in blood. And then, without a single sound, Ranger was gone, through the side door, into the dark, no hesitation, no warning, just the flash of muscle and memory trained not by love, but by something much crueler. Karen screamed. Outside, a man cried out, not in anger or surprise, but in raw, animal panic, the kind you only hear from those who believe death might arrive before regret has time to explain itself. George followed, heart pounding with something too old to be called fear but too sharp to be called rage, and when he rounded the bend by the shed, he saw what was left of the man who'd tried to run. He wasn't dead. Not yet. But he was broken in ways that only something that had once been broken itself could understand, deep bites to the forearm, a shattered kneecap, eyes wide with a terror that had nothing to do with pain and everything to do with recognition. She remembered me, the man sobbed, his breath wet with blood, spitting teeth like confessions. I thought she was dead, we thought she was dead. George leaned in close, not because he pitied the man, but because he needed to hear the truth up close, no lies, no distance, no more courtroom games. Who else was there, he asked, voice low as the frost beneath their boots, steady as the mountain behind his home. The man tried to speak, but something inside him gave out, a lung, a will, maybe just the lie that had been holding his soul together, and then he collapsed, not into death, but into unconsciousness, which in men like that was often more honest anyway. They dragged him inside. Karen patched the wounds, silent and pale, while George finally opened the letter his son wrote on the last week of his life, and though his hands shook, his eyes didn't blink once as they moved over the words. In ink that had smudged with time and maybe tears, Samuel told the story no one believed, about the dogfights, the threats, the photographs, the names whispered behind closed doors and underlined in ledger books locked in basements no one was ever supposed to find. And near the end, in handwriting smaller and more fragile than before, came a single line that changed the shape of George's heart forever. If they hurt me, Dad, it's because I tried to stop them from hurting her. George dropped the letter. Not out of shock, but because his fingers could no longer hold the weight of a truth that heavy and that pure. Ranger was back at the door now, silent again, blood drying in the fur around her mouth, eyes watching the world through a lens no human could survive, but which George now understood completely. That night, they didn't sleep. None of them. Because before dawn, someone set fire to the edge of the woods, not to destroy, but to warn, flames climbing slow and high, spelling something in heat and smoke that couldn't be mistaken for an accident. It was time to finish this. Time to bring the names out from the dark, to drag the last breath of silence into the daylight, and finally let the dead speak. Who gave the order? George asked Karen, eyes locked on the horizon where the fire still burned. And without hesitation, her voice was clear, steady, and final. The judge. He's waiting for you, Karen whispered, her voice tight with fear and something else that felt like quiet awe, as she handed George the map marked in red ink, with one road circled and a single word scrawled beneath it, come alone. George didn't speak, didn't nod, didn't blink, just walked out the door with the shotgun slung over his shoulder and the weight of his son's letter pressing like a second spine against his ribs. The air was thick with that kind of stillness that only happens before storms or funerals, where even the birds stopped singing and the trees seemed to lean in closer, waiting to bear witness. Ranger followed close behind, silent as ever, every muscle taut, her breath low and steady, like she already knew what the night would demand and had accepted it the way only survivors do. They arrived at the old courthouse ruins just as the sun died behind the ridge, leaving only ash-colored light and the long stretch of shadows that made men forget they were once boys. And there, standing alone beneath the skeletal frame of what used to be justice, was Judge Elias Conroy, the man who signed every sealed file, who protected every predator, who sent good boys home in shame and let monsters walk clean. He didn't look surprised to see George. Didn't reach for a gun. Didn't even flinch when Ranger growled low and dark, her eyes locked on him like a memory sharpening its blade. "I always knew you'd come," Conroy said, his voice flat, his posture relaxed, like he thought the script was already written and he'd already rehearsed the ending in his head 100 times. "You sent that boy to die," George said, not shouting, not crying, but with the kind of voice that comes from a place so deep it no longer needs volume to be heard. The judge nodded slowly, as if acknowledging the weather instead of a crime. "He had too many questions," he said. "And too much faith in people who didn't deserve it." George stepped forward, his boots crunching over gravel and broken glass, shotgun lowered but loaded, his heart calm in a way that only men who've already died inside can understand. "He was my son," George said. "I know," the judge replied. "That's why we chose him." Ranger lunged before George could stop her, a blur of fur and vengeance and pain let loose after too many years of cages and commands, but before she reached him, the judge lifted a hand and fired once. The sound cracked through the ruins like thunder splitting wood, and then everything slowed. Ranger fell mid-air, body twisting, a bloom of red rising from her shoulder, her legs kicking uselessly as she hit the ground with a sound George would remember long after the last breath left his own lungs. He dropped to her side, cradled her head, whispered her name, though she never truly had one, just a legacy built from scars and silence and the boy who once tried to protect her when no one else would. And then, without rage, without thought, without hesitation, George stood, lifted the shotgun, and fired. The judge stumbled backward, eyes wide not with pain but surprise, as if, even now, he didn't believe justice could reach him here, after all he'd done and all he'd buried. He dropped to his knees, bleeding, gasping, reaching for something invisible, maybe redemption, maybe power, maybe just air, but George stepped forward, and this time his voice shook not from fear, but from memory. "My boy wrote your name," he said. "And now the world will read it." Behind him, Karen appeared from the trees, her phone already recording, her hands steady, her eyes clear with a fire that once left her broken but now made her brave. She had everything, the judge's face, his confession, the letter, the dog, bleeding but alive, her gaze still fixed on the man who once ordered her death like it was nothing more than paperwork. A week later, the trial began. A month after that, the judge was free. Technicalities. Influence. Fear. The system Samuel once believed in had failed him one final time, and this time it did it publicly, with cameras, applause, and the slow erasure of everything that mattered. But George didn't speak to the press. Didn't rage. Didn't beg. He simply waited. Until the morning Conroy disappeared. No note. No body. No trace. Just silence. And in the woods, beneath a pine tree where the blood had long since washed away, lay an old collar, cracked, burnt, half buried in ash, with the name Ranger etched deep into the leather, and beside it, a photograph. It showed a boy with dark hair, holding a young German shepherd, smiling not like someone who had survived, but like someone who still believed he could save the world. The caption, scribbled in faded pen, read, "She always protected me. I just wish I'd protected her back." George folded the photo, placed it in his pocket, and whispered toward the trees with eyes wet and heart full. "You did, son. You did more than any of us." "They're gone," Karen said, breathless and shaking, as she stood in the cabin doorway holding the empty crate that had once held evidence too dangerous to remain unguarded for even a single night. George turned slowly from the fireplace, where Ranger's collar still rested like a folded flag, and stared at her face, reading not just fear but confusion, the kind that comes when something disappears not with force but with purpose. "There was no break-in," she continued, her voice trembling like the last leaf on a dying tree, "no prints, no damage, just gone, like they were taken by someone who knew exactly what they were doing." George stood without a word, picked up his coat, and walked outside into the early morning fog where the trees whispered low and the earth still remembered blood. He followed the trail not with rage, but with instinct, not the kind taught in war, but the kind learned in grief, sharpened by years of waiting for one more thing to be taken. A mile into the woods, past the bend in the creek and the old oak with the bullet scar from his father's rifle, he found the first sign, a torn strip of burlap caught in a bramble, soaked in milk and pine. And there, beneath the old root system of a half-fallen cedar, he saw what no one could have expected, 6 puppies, huddled together in a shallow den, warm and breathing, their eyes blinking slowly, their bellies full. They were smaller than he imagined, quieter than he expected, and far more alive than anything should have been that came from so much death. Each one bore the marks, not physical scars, but traits passed down like memory, the black streak along the spine, the stillness before movement, the way they tilted their heads not from curiosity but from calculation. George knelt down slowly, not to grab them, not to claim them, but to sit beside them and let them decide for themselves. And one by one, they came forward, noses twitching, tails low, not afraid but cautious, as if something deep in their bones remembered the man who once buried their mother beneath the frost. He carried them home in his coat, 3 at a time, the others following close behind like shadows that had finally found light to chase. Karen cried when she saw them, not out of sorrow, not even from relief, but because it was the first time in weeks that something had returned instead of being taken away. George built their shelter with his own hands, cedar planks, insulated bedding, steel fencing high enough to keep out predators but not high enough to feel like prison. He didn't name them right away. Names, he'd learned, were earned, not given. But in time, one became Sam, in quiet tribute to the boy who tried to make a difference before anyone was ready to believe. Another became Hope, because she ran toward every sound, tail high, as if daring the world to try again. And the third, the smallest, became Jet, not for her mother, but for the look in her eye the moment George whispered, "Stay," and she did. The others would find names in time, in the same way George had found his peace, not all at once, but in pieces, scattered like leaves that eventually learn how to settle. The court never reopened the case. Malone was never found. The judge's home stood empty, full of broken locks and dust-covered books no one would ever open again. But late some nights, when the wind turned just right, George would sit on his porch and listen to the woods, not for threats, not for voices, but for the simple sound of silence that no longer carried the weight of shame. And every so often, one of the pups, usually Hope, would sit beside him, ears perked, eyes forward, like she was listening too, not for danger, but for something coming. And George would smile, not the smile of a man healed, but the smile of a man who finally knew what it meant to forgive what could never be forgotten. On the wall inside the cabin, beside Ranger's collar, hung a single framed photo, a young man holding a small German shepherd, both of them looking at the camera like they believed the world could still be better. Beneath it, etched into wood older than most memories, were the last words Samuel ever wrote. "If love can survive what they did to her, maybe it can survive what they did to me." George never added to it. He didn't have to. Because in the yard below, 6 lives barked, played, and howled at the moon, not because they were haunted, but because they were home. And that was enough. The first sound was a knock, not loud, not frantic, but soft and steady like rain on an old casket, the kind of sound you don't hear until your heart already knows it's too late. George stood up slow from the porch chair, the blanket sliding from his lap, and in that single moment, every bone in his body seemed to tighten around a memory that hadn't yet happened but already felt real. Hope growled first, not out of fear, but in recognition, and the other pups followed suit, circling the door like sentries born from someone else's unfinished war. The second sound came just as George reached the handle, a single breath, released from the other side, the kind a man gives when he's standing on a line he never planned to cross again. He opened the door without a weapon. And there he was. Lester Malone. Alive. Smiling. Holding a leash in one hand and a silver revolver in the other, like he'd just come home from a hunting trip that ended in something far darker than deer. I knew you'd be too tired to lock it, Malone said, stepping inside as if he still had the right to walk through that door without consequence, as if a shared past excused every line since crossed. George didn't speak, not because he was afraid, but because there were no words left that hadn't already been used to bury the dead. I watched the trial, Malone continued, voice low, steady, the kind used by men who lie for a living and believe in their own stories. You thought it was over. You thought justice was something that could be wrapped in paper and signed with a gavel. He knelt, pet one of the pups, Sam, without permission, without blinking, and looked up with eyes that held no shame, only calculation. But you forgot something, he said, and now the smile faded. The truth didn't kill me, George. You just wounded the part of me that cared whether anyone knew. George stepped forward once, eyes locked not on the gun but on the leash, and it was then he saw what hung at the other end. Another dog. A young German shepherd, gaunt, quiet, eyes empty, not fearful, not wild, just resigned, like whatever had once lived inside had been pulled out slowly and left to dry in the sun. You brought a replacement, George said finally, voice like gravel rolling in thunder, each word as heavy as a shovel full of dirt. Malone nodded, no shame in the gesture. You burn one, another rises. It's the nature of the business, he said. You kill the judge, the cage breaks. But the market finds a way to rebuild. That was when Karen stepped from the hallway, her phone already filming, voice low but unshaken, like she'd walked through every hell he'd ever built and found fire on the other side. We're recording now, Lester, she said. You talk, you confess, or you vanish tonight in the same silence you used on those kids. Malone didn't blink. Didn't flinch. He just smiled again, the slow, hollow kind, and whispered. You think I haven't vanished before? And then came the third sound. The creak of a second door opening. Not the front. Not the back. But the basement. The one George had sealed years ago, after Samuel's funeral, with boards thick enough to hold back grief but not truth. They all turned at once, every dog alert, every breath caught, as a figure stepped slowly into the frame of that open space, one hand dragging something metal, the other holding a set of old cassette tapes marked in red ink. It was Marvin Calloway, the former deputy who'd disappeared 2 weeks before the trial, presumed dead, assumed silenced, but now here, alive, limping, and burned on one side from something that smelled like gasoline and betrayal. I took the tapes, he said, voice ragged, clothes torn, eyes full of something that couldn't be faked. I couldn't let you burn everything, Lester. Not this time. Malone froze, not in fear, but in calculation. And that's when Ranger's youngest pup, the one without a name yet, lunged without sound or signal, straight at the leash, tearing the new dog free before leaping at Malone's arm and dragging the revolver to the floor. A single shot rang out, tore through the cabin wall, shattered a photo frame, not of Samuel, but of George in uniform, back when he still believed the world could be made better through discipline and loyalty alone. Malone ran. But he didn't make it far. Because this time, there were teeth waiting in the dark that remembered everything. The scream didn't come from Lester, it came from the dog he dragged through hell, now free and wild-eyed, standing over him not as a victim but as a witness, jaws stained and eyes finally alive with something like purpose. George reached the clearing just as the last echo of that scream dissolved into the trees, the wind catching it like a funeral hymn carried out toward the mountains where no lies could reach. Malone was down, bleeding from the side, one arm useless, the other clawing at the dirt like a man trying to bury himself before the truth could finish digging. He looked up at George, not as an enemy, not even as a man, but as something smaller, something broken, like a ghost finally realizing it's already been judged by the very place it thought it could hide in forever. You don't have to finish it, Karen said softly behind him, stepping into the circle of breathless trees with the pups flanking her like tiny soldiers who'd inherited loyalty instead of fear. George didn't lift the shotgun. Didn't step forward. Didn't speak. Instead, he crouched beside the fallen man and reached into his coat, not for a weapon, but for a tape recorder, cracked and dusty, the one Marvin had pulled from the basement where too many voices had been left unheard. He pressed play. And the sound that came from it wasn't static, wasn't screaming, wasn't even evidence. It was a boy's voice, quiet and calm, telling the truth in the only way he could without being silenced. "If they come for me," Samuel's voice said, so clear and young that George had to close his eyes to keep the memory from crushing him, "please don't try to fight them. Don't go to war again. Just show them what they did." Lester cried then. Not for what he'd done, but because in that moment, the power he'd built for decades, the system he'd corrupted, the children he'd used and buried in silence, all of it meant nothing against a boy's voice that refused to vanish. The trial didn't need to happen again. The story spread like fire across county lines, and for once, it didn't burn down the wrong things. Veterans started talking. Journalists who'd once turned away came back with cameras. And every tape, every voice, was played not in court, but in churches, at PTA meetings, across barbershops and schoolyards, where old men wept and young mothers listened harder than they ever had before. Malone vanished from public record within weeks, not through murder, not through escape, but because no one, not even the state, wanted to remember what it meant that he'd been allowed to live free for so long. George didn't see him again. Didn't need to. Because by then, something larger had taken root, something slower, gentler, stronger than rage. The pups had grown, not just in size, but in presence, and each one had found a purpose. Two served with the Ranger Corps upstate, one was certified as a therapy dog for veterans battling night terrors, and the smallest, the wildest, the one who bit Lester's hand, never left George's side. She didn't need a name. She had a place. And on quiet evenings, when the fire was low and the wind carried nothing but pine and the scent of wood smoke, George would sit on the porch with her, sip his coffee, and watch the sun ease down without fear of what the dark might bring. The letter from Samuel stayed in a drawer, never displayed, never shown, not because it wasn't sacred, but because George had already lived every word, carried every line, breathed every sorrow until it folded into something almost peaceful. Karen came by sometimes. Not often. But always when it mattered. She never stopped writing, and her book, Ranger, The Dog Who Remembered, became something more than bestseller or exposé. It became a kind of balm. A slow prayer. A reminder that silence is only power when no one has the courage to bark first. George read it once. Just once. Then put it on the shelf beside Samuel's old baseball glove, the worn collar from Ranger, and a single photograph, one he'd never shown anyone, not even Karen. It was Samuel, standing in the rain, holding Ranger's face in both hands, his eyes not full of pain or loss, but wonder. Beneath it, in ink faded to near invisibility, were the only words George had ever heard him say the day that photo was taken. "She's not a dog. She's what I want to be when I grow up." And that was what finally made George cry. Not because of what was lost, but because, for the first time in years, he finally understood what had been saved.